Hi, my name is Mike, and we're going to talk about trains. The first train that we really need to talk about with this whole pack is the Planet locomotive, which you're going to find in Great Britain. The Planet is not the first locomotive used in Britain, but it's one of the first that was used in a sort of industrial, not quite mass-produced way, but it had a standard design which was actually used and reused. The most famous of the early British locomotives is probably the Rocket, but the Rocket was a one-off. It wasn't replicated again and again. The Planet was. The Planet was a successful design. It was used by multiple railroads. You're going to see it on multiple railroads in Vicky 3, and we're going to see that design appear again and again in other countries because it was so successful. One of the best places to see that Planet design get reused is, in fact, the United States. In the United States, we start off with a locomotive called the John Bull. The John Bull started life as a Planet locomotive. It was exported from Britain to the United States in the 1830s. The Planet design was very successful in the UK, and so it was one of the first things exported. A Planet locomotive was exported to the US in 1834, called the John Bull. It was called that because John Bull is the personification of Britain and all that. And when they used the John Bull in the United States, they discovered it wasn't really fit for conditions in America. American rails were cheaper, they were windier, they didn't have the same support that they did in Britain. So after one season of use, they started to make some small tweaks to the John Bull. Just, maybe a larger light in the front, cover the driver because the weather was worse in the United States. And over time, the John Bull became this sort of ship of Theseus. It was retired in the 1870s after 40 some odd years of use. And by the time it was retired, it looked like an entirely different creature. It had a different smokestack. It had extra wheels slapped to the front. It had a pilot or a cow catcher attached to the front as well. The tender had turned into this enormous cab. It was almost unrecognizable. And yet, at its core, it was still the same locomotive, just with every part replaced over time. In the 1890s, the old retired John Bull was pulled back out, dusted off, and refurbished a bit for the 1893 World's Fair. They wanted to show off the history of American locomotion and railroading. And when they did this, they tried to undo some of the changes that had been done to the John Bull over time, but they didn't have the original records anymore. So what they ended up with was this weird hybrid of the original design plus some of the later modifications. This is what we're using in Vicky 3 because I think it shows a good transitionary stage in early American engineering and railroading. It's about this weird ramshackle, we don't know what we're doing, we're getting parts from everywhere, let's throw things together and see what works. That's the core of early American railroading, and I think the John Bull exemplifies it perfectly. On the other side, we have the Cherepanov locomotive used in Russia early on. The Cherepanov locomotive also dates from the 1830s, and it's one of the first locomotives used in Russian railroading. It's very similar to the Planet design. It doesn't vary that much, and it wasn't as successful as the Planet because the Cherepanov locomotive was a wood-burning locomotive, unlike the coal-burning locomotives of Britain. And frankly, it just didn't have the power at the time to cover the vast distances required to connect Russian cities together. It was an interesting experiment. The locomotive itself was sound, but railroading conditions at the time were very challenging for Russia, and investment in the early years wasn't that hot. The Cherepanov locomotive still exemplifies what early Russian railroading was like. Experimental, trying out different designs from different places, struggling to find the right niche to fit in under the economic and technological conditions that Russia was facing at the time. Then you have the Saxonia, used by German states in Victoria III, but obviously not from all of Germany at the time. The Saxonia is an embellishment upon the Planet type. It starts to show some unique features of early German designs. Germany began by importing tons of British designs, and over time they got much better at these things and started to add their own little flares. The Adler locomotive is one of the first German locomotives used, but the Saxonia, I believe, is more emblematic of early German railroading. You can see these nice little flares. The smokestack has this wonderful little ironwork at the top. The wheels look much more like carriage wheels. They got this wonderful little flower design going on. They're starting to experiment with their own wheel configurations. The Adler is basically a copy of a British locomotive, but the Saxonia is actually trying out something new and useful specifically for German railroads. Then we have our French locomotive, Le Continent. It's a generation after the other locomotives, but still emblematic of early French railroading. Le Continent is a Crampton locomotive. It's basically a dragster for railroads. It's got 2 unpowered wheels in the front and 1 huge big wheel in the back, so that every time the wheel just rotates once, it goes super far because it's just 1 big wheel. It doesn't have a lot of grip, but it goes very fast. And French railroads wanted that because their main priority was connecting stuff to Paris. Around Paris, it's flat. You don't have to worry about having a ton of grip to go up and down hills. Your Crampton locomotives, like Le Continent, that you, again, will see in Vicky 3, are perfect for early French railroads. Not a lot of power, fast, able to go where you need to go. In this case, Paris. That's the only place that's important. By the middle of the Victorian era, more railroads and more countries were starting to experiment with more radical designs. The novelty of the large wheel of the Crampton was built upon later on by British engineers, and you can find a perfect example of this big wheel, go fast design with the Stirling locomotive, which will appear in Britain in the mid-Victorian era in Vicky 3. The Stirling, again, has 1 humongous wheel, which helps it go very fast, doesn't help it with pull large heavy loads, but Britain doesn't really need that. Britain is still ultimately an island that doesn't cover very vast distances, relatively speaking. You need something that goes fast, but you don't need it to go that far. Something like the Stirling is perfect for that. It's good for passenger service, okay with freight service, but it's good for that. On the other end of the scale, when it comes to working conditions, you have the Jupiter. This is the United States' mid-era locomotive of choice. It is a 440, the American locomotive. It is the perfect design for the conditions of mid-century America. It's robust, it can take a beating, it's a simple design that's just as flexible with freight as it is with passenger service, and it looks pretty too. I mean, come on, look at that. Look at the fancy gilding, look at the paintwork. It's got this big old smokestack on top. It's a great locomotive. Everybody was using this design from like the 1840s up until 1880s even. And then it gradually starts to filter out of use. But you can still see these 440s on like smaller short lines up until the end of the steam era, really. For an even more long-lived design of locomotive, we have the Südbahn Class 23 representing German locomotives. Now, Germany covers a lot of ground with a lot of different requirements for geography, for traffic and stuff. It's hard to find a perfectly emblematic locomotive for all cases everywhere. But this Austrian Railways Südbahn Class 23, I think is pretty good. It ended up being dispersed amongst other countries after World War I, but it was originally built in the 1860s, and the last instances of the class being retired happened in 1953. Most were retired in the 1920s, but some of these lasted for 90 years after entering service. The Südbahn Class 23 was a very simple design, very robust, good for medium haul stuff with practically everything. There's still some surviving examples of it in Austria and Germany that you can find at various museums. Then we have the Class G locomotive in Russia. The Class G is much like the Südbahn, a 6-wheeler type of locomotive, better for freight than for passenger service, but very robust design. Like the United States, Russian railroading required hauling things over vast distances with little infrastructure support. So their locomotives ended up having very similar looks to American ones. They're simple to fix, fairly versatile with whatever fuel they can deal with. They're just meant to run things over a long distance and not have to worry too much about like what you have to build to support them. This is in contrast to our final locomotive, a French locomotive that required a lot of work, broke down once quite famously. I apologize to our French viewers, but I'm going to butcher the name just a little bit, but it's the Class 170 Ouest. Most famous for its central role in the Montparnasse crash, where it actually had its brakes fail, blasted right through a terminus, crashed through the outer wall of the station, and then tumbled down a floor into the street below. It's not the most reliable of locomotives, but it's very emblematic of French engineering and French design in the later Victorian era. These sorts of locomotives, although they had some engineering faults, remained in service up through World War I. These are the sorts of things that you would still see hauling troops up to the front in Flanders, might even still be chugging along, wheezing along, really, in the 1920s. We've picked out 10 locomotive designs that cover the whole span of steam railroading history. They'll be with you from the very beginning of the game through to the end, and will provide so much more flavor to every corner of the globe. I enjoyed picking them out, and I hope you enjoy them just as much. Bye.